Thanks, Tara, for inviting me to do this. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to my colleagues, in not just social settings, but also intellectually productive ones as well. So thanks for your presentations. I always love seeing the latest work, and hopefully all of the effective students did as well. It showed a really great range, I think, of the expertise and the capabilities of our school to really work on pressing challenges, but also explore rigorous opportunities as well. If you know me, I like big questions about architecture. So a lot of my questions, I have 7 questions. I don't know if we'll get through all of them. But I think all of you can answer them at any sort of pace or any sort of way that you want to. I can get more specific if you need to, but I like open big questions. They help me sort of think critically about what matters about architecture. I think all of us care about architecture mattering. I don't think all of you do as well. But the first one is in relation to design and research. And I was interested if any of you or all of you could talk a little bit about how you characterize the role of research in your respective studios and how that informs design decisions.
Hear me now? Yeah. So it's a good question. So the research component, because we now have a body of work program, we're able to reflect pretty quickly on the past. So we always start by looking at what we did, making comparisons, really analyzing what's working, what isn't, really questioning what this definition of affordability is. Right? It's either cheap to build at the beginning or it's affordable to operate over time. And that has the implications on what we do. So the research starts internally, but then of course we have to look outside as well to see what others are doing around the world, not just in this country. And we have in recent years, I didn't show this because we only had 6 minutes, but we teamed up with the national architecture firm, Evans. They have offices here and in Kansas City and in Phoenix and in San Francisco. So we started to play with this topic of national translation where, okay, here's how we're handling issues here in New Orleans in a hot, humid climate. What happens if we try to do these things in Kansas City? Or what happens if we try to do these things, especially in Phoenix? And if I had an hour to speak, I could have shown you some of those examples. But that's really the way we've been handling the research the last few years to see, okay, how do these things work here? How do they replicate? How do those replications work elsewhere? Because we're preparing you guys not just to stay here and work, we're preparing you for the world. So we can't only speak about the things that function well here. We need to think in a much grander scale. And that's exactly what Marita and Ruben are doing as well. They're asking you all to think outside the box.
So in terms of research, can you hear me? Yeah, maybe I can just focus on one specific scale, which is the building scale. So, I mean, architects are known for tackling holistically several materials or systems. No? And there's one question to me that is important is the role of infrastructures in the built environment. So infrastructures of the modernity, the 20th century, are single function. They a power plant, electrical substation, they are planned to be built to provide one function only. And I think there is a role for architects to rethink the archetype or the typology of infrastructure in a novel way. So it's not only responding to the integration of this infrastructure into the built environment, but it's also using less energy to do the same performative functions. I think there's a role for architects to reimagine new typologies of the 20th century. And in the past, of course, we had hospitals in the 19th century hospitals were different than the hospitals of the 20th century, right? So the 19th century, the hospitals were open to gardens. They included natural ventilation. They were formally different and performatively different. When we evolved into the climatic systems, the hospitals now are super compact and close to the outside, etc. What are the hospitals of the next century if we think health in a different way? So the form of the building is related to the way it performs and it responds to societal problems. And the same thing can happen with an electrical substation. It can happen with a church, etc. So I think there's an innovation needed, and that's design research. It's a question for us to tackle.
To maybe complement also those thoughts, because especially in our case, as most of the final step, the final design that the students are doing is always in this intermediate scale between the city and the architectural object, let's say. The initial research is kind of basic for what we are doing, no? Especially when you are just trying to understand a city in a different place that you live with a different culture in a different continent, that in our case, no, in Africa, in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, that you need to understand also that complexity from different perspectives. So these first steps where we just make these more urban researches is basic, then just to start to try to understand maybe some answers, or at least to make the big questions, no, that then you will need to answer with your design. No, in that case, in our case, we have these general topics that we try to explore from the beginning, but there is always this room, this space that each student then also can select and can add also its personal agenda, its personal obsessions, its personal questions, that then also can be applied, of course, to the next step, that in that case it will be with this intervention between this intermediate scale between urban or landscape or architecture.
Fantastic. Maybe I might jump to the next question, just to keep it moving on. And maybe Emily and Charles, you can jump in on this one. And this was something that I felt immediately upon joining school in 2016, was that New Orleans was a real opportunity for advanced architectural production and advanced architectural thought. And I'm thinking, and I guess my question is how do you view New Orleans as a ground for advanced architectural practices, as a ground for advanced research in urbanism? And how do you use it as a site that has broader impact that we can use to leverage for larger global understanding as well? Byron, you were the one who really helped me see that when I first got here as well. So like, if you want to dive in on that, you can as well. But Emily and Charles, you both work a lot in New Orleans, and specifically in your studios.
Yeah, I guess, thinking about the phrase like crisis precipitates innovation. The city is really, it's in from a geographic perspective, an elevation perspective, with the political region it sits in perspective. I think there's a lot of pressures that really kind of forces us to innovate. That I think maybe if things were a lot better or a lot streamlined, more comfortable, there may be a little bit less of the energy from our side to try and match that. So for me, I guess that's kind of the fun.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's so many ways to answer that question too. And I think for us, a lot of times we look at other design centers that are operating, and not all of them, but some of them seem to have an agenda that they're imposing on their place. And I think that the ethos here is different than that. It's It's about understanding, being part of the place, and also being in conversation with folks here and establishing research agendas and design agendas together. And it's not, I don't think it's this like experiment on the place ethos. It's more of a like, let's figure this out together ethos. And I'd like not to go too far into metaphor, but I think the other unique thing about New Orleans is that, you know, there's a lot of history here, like a built history here that people know and love and feel secure in, which allows us to then innovate formally, typologically, in a way that, like, you know, in the metaphor I'll go to is music. You know, we have a deep history of traditional jazz that people know and love, but we also have New Orleans funk, and even more recently bounce, and all these different things that like grow out of a history of a place, but are not, like bounce is not traditional jazz in the same way that like an urban build house is not like a regular shotgun, but urban build houses know the typology and then start to innovate off of that typology. And so I think that I think being in a place that knows itself and has a history allows you to then build off of that history and be more innovative and creative in ways that are not as like handcuffed by history.
I want to build upon that because I don't know how familiar you all are with the city, but it's authentic, right? New Orleans is a real old city. There's an established culture here, which allows us to have a greater ability to understand progress and preservation through contrast. And it's also a city that's quite problematic, small. That allows us to think about urban intervention in achievable ways. Right? We're able to identify and invent programs that we can actually accomplish. We're not working in Manhattan, we're not working in Chicago, right? We're in a city that's manageable and friendly. And at every level, the people of this city are incredibly hospitable. But it's also a friendlier climate. Like we can build here year-round, unlike my colleagues in Kansas City who have to shut down their design build operations come wintertime. So I think that the city facilitates our goals quite well. But most importantly, I always ask our students to carefully consider that difference between preservation and progress. I think because we have authentically old habits here, anything fresh is acceptable. That wasn't the case before Hurricane Katrina, right? Before Katrina, this city was in love with its own nostalgic presence. Since Katrina, when people realized much of what we had failed, they've been more open to fresh ideas. So that tragedy did offer some opportunity as well.
Maybe, Dara, one more question, or should we wrap it up? Okay. Maybe one last question. What's it? Oh, yeah. I'll ask one more. Or do you want me to open it up now? Okay. I'm over there. That was my last question. You know, I mean, for days like this, I like kind of thinking about where all of you are at and thinking back to when I was in your shoes and what made me super excited about architecture. And when I was applying to architecture schools and I was thinking about it, when I finally got into it, I discovered a field where I could explore it from so many different vantage points that I was never sort of unable to pursue my curiosity. And that's what I really love about the field and the discipline. And so I see in the research that we do a systematic investigation, you know, but then I also see the pursuit of creative innovation. And so, you know, the way that I define creativity is it's practiced curiosity. It's not something that's innate, but creativity is something that's really practiced and learned and earned, you know, through effort. And I guess like what I'd like to hear from maybe the panelists is what really excites you about architecture? What are its greatest opportunities? And what are its real challenges? Like why is architecture the field that all of these prospective students should be entering?
I mean, it's super exciting field, one, of course, but I think for one reason is that in general, we are aiming for cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary ways of collaborating because we know that the problems are complex. And that's, I mean, scientists and people in different fields are trying of course, to do that, but architecture is a field that is both a specialization of the building, but also we are a generalist of the building. And I think this capacity of being generalist with different emphasis on specialties in different things, it can be urbanism, it can be small scale or large scale, etc. It gives you the capacity to move to any, I mean, economics or other fields later, that because you have this generalist mindset, this generalist, this training as generalist, which I think it's awesome.
I just like making stuff.
Oh, come on, Byron. Yeah, I don't mean, I guess for me, it's what these guys both said for sure. And sometimes I feel like we're in a world where everything is on screens and digital, and there's plenty of that in architecture for sure. But there's also a chance to just like make a thing real, like in the real world, and to make a place that shelters people or houses conversations or I can't describe how gratifying it is to go into a space that you've designed and see it in use, and see it being used for things you never even imagined. And so just to me, it's like, it's that reality of it all, like being able to influence the world in ways that could be bad, but mostly good. And also I'll say a friend of ours, Coleman Coker, likes to talk about how optimistic the field of architecture is. If you're not going to work on a project for 3 or 5 or 7 years, like you're not going to sit there and design a hospital because you're a pessimist. Like you're trying to make the world better, and I don't know, it's just like, there's something about the attitude and impact that you can have as an architect that's really great.
Yeah, I agree totally, and I also think that at least for me, this way of being architect 24/7 and seeing, being curious and trying to see everything that is around and trying to see on how to improve everything from the point of view of an architect. I think that is one of the most exciting parts or components of our also realize that we are working, or we have been working from very small things, very small components, very small objects, okay, to improve other people's lives to big scale, not to see. So just to be open and trying to be curious and thinking of how to solve and being hungry of learning more on solving problems. I think that is the most interesting thing.
I was going to say exactly that. And I guess with Margarita's point about the generalist, I think that, like for me, the relationships with people are more important than like build work, I guess, because I think those, one, in terms of working with other experts, I think you know, I certainly always try to make sure that level of curiosity is really high, and I have no problem with letting people know that I don't know things. And I feel like once you open up in that way, collaborations like work a lot better. Once you're kind of like trusting someone else's expertise and not trying to solve everything yourself. So I think, yeah, I feel like a lot of the future of the architectural discipline is changing, and I think we have a lot more agency to figure out what the questions are for the problem, rather than just providing solutions for the problem that may have already been set up.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Are there any questions from the audience? We probably have a couple more minutes.
I can use my teacher voice, so that's fine. Hi, I'm Annalise, and I have a question about the separation between privatization and gentrification. At what point do you, if you had a question out there, how do you measure a project success? And working with communities like in New Orleans or Rockridge, and you're revitalizing these communities and you're pricing these people out of homes. At what point do you make sure that we're serving the community? And at what point do you realize that we're actually?
That's a loaded and very good question that we deal with. So we deal with that a lot, especially with the urban build houses, because we can be challenged as being part of the gentrification process. It's interesting, we work with neighborhood housing services. What they do is they put home buyers in touch with lenders or resources that can help them to buy a home. They educate them on that. And what we found in the Central City neighborhood is that when the locals are made aware of these support programs, they tend to want to use that support to get out of Central City rather than stay and help make a difference. The people moving in tend to be young professionals. That's not true. Timothy was a basically school teacher. And we had Tammy. And we were really helping to satisfy our mission of helping those in need until the real estate meltdown in 2008. After that meltdown, the nonprofit we were working with had to provide their own comps for lenders. So this might be good, this is getting good. But really quickly, they would no longer establish comps for new progressive homes in older neighborhood settings because there weren't other things to compare them to. So they had to start selling our urban build projects at market rate. That went on from 2008 to 2012, a little longer than that. Did not sit well with us. And in fact, that's why we now work with the Lutheran Church to sort of get out of that control. The city will recognize inhabitants of homes. People have been there for a certain duration of time and lock them in at a tax rate. And we stay in touch with them. So if we're working in an inner city neighborhood, developing an urban build project, we meet our neighbors. We make sure that they're locked in at their rates. Now, if they sell their home, whoever buys that home, they don't get that same privilege. But the city does recognize that problem. And I tell you, it's a battle that we haven't been able to resolve. There was Alex Krieger was here once giving a lecture on urbanism. And he said that some improvement in gentrification is necessary for inner city improvement. What we have to do is find a way to support those who are there.
Well, and I don't think I have great answers either, but it's definitely something we're aware of and constantly in conversation with our partners and stakeholders about how can we do this. So for instance, like how can we, I'll give you an example, Bayou Road, I'm sure you know the Bayou Road community in town. There was a facade renew grant to renovate facades along historic commercial corridors, and Bayou Road was identified as one of the corridors. We met with all of the store owners there, which are largely African American run and women run businesses on the corridor. And we said, all right, here's the deal. There's some money that we could potentially tap into to restore facades, but we want to try to do this in a way that does not increase or does not like add jet fuel to the gentrification issues that are already happening in town. And so before we even devised the program with Nora, we sat down with business owners and banks and tried to figure out how can we do this in a way that is like thoughtful and not adding to the problem. I'll say, in some ways that worked well, like Vera Warren Wilson's, Mama Vera is still at Community Books. Beverly McKenna's businesses are all thriving. The thing that that really gave us pause though is that at some point, this building that Poche Construction was in got taken over by Uber. And we were like, oh dear, this is how it happens. And it definitely like had sent shutters through the community on Bayou Road. So I think even if you go into it with like really good intentions and best practices, there's still unintended consequences. And we haven't figured it all out yet, but I think we're trying to work with all the partners to try to figure this out and make sure that people are not being displaced, but able to stay where they want to stay. And do that in a way that's equitable and just, and yeah. Like, I don't know, there's this wave rolling through the city and it's trying to figure out how to hang on and like protect the folks that want to stay where they're at.
Questions? One more question.
So what is the role of art and design in the curriculum? And also, is there any education on like the psychological effect of architecture? Do we learn about that in the curriculum?
I'll try to jump in on some of that. The role of art in the curriculum, it's going to be dependent upon the faculty that you work with and how much that is something that is kind of pushed as an agenda or how it's sort of addressed as some of the architecture sort of participates with. I mean, my minor field of specialization for a PhD is aesthetic philosophy. So I focus on that pretty explicitly, various ways that I teach, various ways that I approach course content. So for me, like arts practices, thinking about architecture in relation to arts practices and the cultural context of creative production is pretty paramount for the way I think to teach. Psychological effects, that's a trickier one. I think it's funny, like also back when I was working my PhD, I was thinking, I want to do neuroscience with architecture. And then I realized, wow, I would need an additional 10 years of training to actually make any headway with that as a subject. That said, I do think like if you have interests in allied fields, you can certainly take courses, sometimes for credit, sometimes as kind of an elected, as a, what's the right term?
Independent study.
Well, independent study or auditing. So you can audit a course in another department. And that would be ways to help augment some of your deeper interest with architecture. And so the way that I talk about that with my thesis students, so I teach the graduate thesis sequence. It's like psychology, fine arts, etc. I think of those as framing discourses, as allied fields and allied disciplines to help augment the precision and depth with which you can explore progressive sort of positions for the discipline of architecture. So I would encourage students to find those, but as a formal sort of setup, you have to sort of talk to individual faculty or look deeply within the university.